Welcome to our deep dive into psychology.
Ooh, I like that. A deep dive.
Yeah, we'll be using the OpenStax textbook, Psychology 2E.
A classic.
It is. So think of this deep dive as a crash course on the human mind, breaking down key insights and fascinating facts. We'll be exploring different schools of thought in psychology.
Like, how do psychologists actually study the mind?
Right, and the ethical considerations too. Plus, those surprising ways our brains work.
It's really incredible.
It is. And to kick things off, let's trace psychology back to its roots. You might be surprised to learn it's a relatively young field.
Yeah, it all really started in the late 19th century with Wilhelm Wundt.
But okay.
Yeah, he was a big deal. He established the first experimental psychology lab.
So like the OG of psychology lab.
Exactly. And his focus was on introspection, having people look inward and try to observe their own thoughts and feelings.
But how reliable is that really? Our own thoughts can be all over the place, right?
That's the thing. Introspection turned out to be pretty subjective. What one person experiences is totally different from another, making it tough to get those consistent scientific results.
That makes sense. So psychology had to move on from there, right?
Yeah. Around the same time, you had William James. He championed a different approach called functionalism.
Okay, functionalism.
Basically, he was less interested in the structure of thoughts and way more curious about their purpose. Like, what's the function of all this thinking? How does it help us survive and thrive in the world?
Ah, so it's like asking, what's the point of it all, in a way?
Exactly. And what's cool is that functionalism really embraced Darwin's theory of evolution, seeing mental abilities as adaptations, honed by natural selection to help us solve problems and ensure our survival.
I like that. So it's not just about what we think, but why we think that way.
Exactly. And that evolutionary perspective still influences psychology today.
Now, I feel like we can't talk about psychology without mentioning Sigmund Freud. Talk about revolutionary ideas.
Oh, Freud, absolutely. He shook things up with psychoanalysis, emphasizing the power of the unconscious. Those hidden drives and desires we aren't even aware of, yet they influence our every thought and action.
It's like an iceberg. We only see the tip.
Exactly. And Freud also highlighted the importance of early childhood experiences, right? Suggesting that those early relationships leave a lasting imprint on our personality.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like those early years really shape who we become as adults.
Right. Now, some of Freud's ideas are still debated today, but his impact on therapy, huge.
He's basically the father of talk therapy.
Exactly. And then you have figures like Abraham Maslow. Remember his hierarchy of needs? That pyramid where basic needs like food and shelter have to be met before higher level needs like self-actualization can even come into play.
Oh yeah, the hierarchy of needs. It makes you think about what's driving your own behavior, right?
Yeah.
Where are you on that pyramid right now?
Totally. So we've got introspection, functionalism, psychoanalysis, and the hierarchy of needs, all huge in the history of psychology.
And each one shaped how we understand the mind today. But there's so much more.
Oh, tons. Like cognitive psychology, for example. It kind of brought the focus back to those mental processes. Thinking, learning, remembering.
Right, so instead of just focusing on outward behavior, it digs into how we think.
Exactly. And that led to a lot of breakthroughs, understanding things like memory and learning.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's developmental psychology, right?
Yes. All about how we change across our entire lifespan.
From babies to, well, us now.
It's crucial for understanding the different stages of development, the challenges at various ages, and how experiences shape who we become.
I wonder how my own childhood experiences shaped me. Food for thought there.
And speaking of which, you might be thinking about a career in psychology after this deep dive.
A lot of people assume you need a PhD to be a psychologist, right? Is that true?
It depends on what you want to do. A doctorate, usually a PhD, is typically required for the academic and research side of things.
So like teaching at a university or conducting research?
Exactly. But if you want to work directly with people, there are tons of other options. Counseling, clinical psychology, school psychology, all of these are amazing paths.
And most of those require a master's degree.
Right. So you see, a background in psychology is pretty versatile. It's not just about being a professor. You could work in hospitals, clinics, government agencies.
You can even start your own private practice.
Exactly.
That's so cool. But how do psychologists actually, study the mind? It's not all just theories, right?
Oh, definitely not. Psychology is a science. It uses rigorous research methods, just like any other scientific field.
So real experiments, data, the whole shebang.
Exactly. Experiments are a biggie, helping us figure out cause and effect. Think about those classic studies on conformity.
Oh, the ones where people have to judge the length of lines and end up conforming to the group, even if it's wrong.
Exactly. But there are other methods too, like surveys to gather data from tons of people, and archival research, where we dig into existing records and documents to uncover trends and answer questions.
That's like being a detective of the mind.
Totally. And with all this research, we always keep ethics top of mind.
That's super important.
Yeah, we're dealing with human participants. We need to make sure they understand the research and protect their privacy.
Makes sense. Okay, so now let's get to the biological side of things. The nitty-gritty of how our brains work. After all, our thoughts, emotions, actions, it all comes from the brain, right?
Right. The brain is the command center.
So remind me, what are neurons exactly?
Think of them as the messengers of the nervous system.
Mhm.
Specialized cells that transmit information, through electrical and chemical signals.
Okay, so neurons are messengers, got it. But what about glial cells?
Oh, they're the support staff.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, they provide that structural support, insulation, and nutrients to those neurons. They keep everything running smoothly.
So they're essential too.
Totally. And then you have those neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that allow neurons to talk to each other. They're like tiny keys unlocking communication. They regulate everything from our mood to how we move.
Wow, it's so intricate. So things like dopamine and serotonin are those neurotransmitters.
Yep. And imbalances in those neurotransmitters can actually lead to various psychological disorders. That's why medications targeting them are often used in treatment.
It's like a delicate dance happening in our brains all the time.
Yeah.
And we can actually see it now with brain imaging.
Yeah, it's amazing. We can see which parts of the brain light up when we experience different things.
It's like a window into the mind.
Exactly. And it helps us understand how different areas of the brain are involved in various functions. But don't forget, the brain doesn't work alone. The endocrine system's a big player too.
The endocrine system, right.
It's like the body's postal service, with hormones acting as the letters carrying messages throughout the body.
So the brain and the endocrine system are working together.
Totally. They influence everything from our growth to our metabolism to our mood.
It's all connected.
It is. And speaking of interconnectedness, our next stop takes us to the fascinating world of sensation and perception.
Ooh, this is where it gets really interesting. How do our senses create the world we experience?
Right, we're bombarded with information constantly. But our brains somehow make sense of it all. It's like our brains are constantly filtering and interpreting the world, creating our own unique perceptions.
But are our perceptions always accurate?
That's the thing. Gestalt psychology, for example, it emphasizes how we perceive wholes rather than just parts. Our brains are always trying to find patterns and make meaning, even if the information's incomplete.
So we're not just passively taking in information, we're actively shaping our understanding of the world.
Exactly. And think about optical illusions. Those trick our brains into seeing things that aren't actually there.
Oh yeah, that's so cool. So our brains fill in the gaps, make assumptions, and use our past experiences to interpret the world.
Exactly. Even our emotional state can influence what we see.
It's amazing how much is happening beneath the surface.
The power of the mind. Not just a receiver, but an active interpreter.
So much to uncover there.
Absolutely. And next time, we'll dive into the specific senses and how they create that tapestry of experience.
I can't wait.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time we were talking about psychology's history, the different schools of thought, and how the mind is studied.
Right, all those big names and theories.
Now we're going to dive into learning and memory. It's amazing, right? How our brains can pick up new things and store them away.
It's like we just do it, but we rarely stop and think about how it all works.
Exactly. And learning, well, it's essential for our survival, for adapting, for everything.
True. We'd be in trouble if we couldn't learn from our experiences. So how does it work? What's happening in our brains when we learn?
Well, one of the most basic ways is classical conditioning. Think Pavlov.
Oh yeah, Pavlov's dogs. I vaguely remember that from school.
Right. He noticed his dogs started salivating at the sound of footsteps, not just when they saw food. So he paired the sound of a bell with food.
So the dogs learn to associate the bell with food.
Exactly. Eventually, they'd salivate at the sound of the bell alone, even without food. It's a new association.
Wow, so we're all kind of like Pavlov's dogs, learning through these connections.
In a way, yeah. That's happening all the time, even in advertising. They pair products with images or music that make you feel good, hoping you'll associate those feelings with the product.
Sneaky. That explains those catchy jingles that get stuck in your head.
Another important one is operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner was a big name there. This one's all about consequences shaping behavior.
Rewards and punishments.
Yep. Behaviors with positive consequences, rewards get repeated. Behaviors with negative consequences, punishments, less so.
Makes sense. It's like training a pet, treats for good behavior.
Exactly. Operant conditioning, super powerful, used everywhere. Parenting, education, even therapy.
And there's observational learning too, right? Like when we learn by watching others.
Oh yeah, observational learning, also called social learning. It's fascinating. We pick up new behaviors just by observing and imitating.
So that's how kids learn so much from their parents.
Totally. Think about Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. Kids watched adults being aggressive towards a doll, then imitated that behavior.
That's a bit scary, actually. Shows we can learn negative stuff too, not just good things.
Definitely makes you think about the importance of good role models, especially now with social media.
So we've covered how we learn, but how about how we remember? Our brains can store so much information.
Memory. It's a whole other world. There are three main stages: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Think of encoding like taking a mental snapshot and turning it into a code the brain understands.
Like translating it into brain language.
Exactly. Then comes storage, filing that snapshot away in the brain's library. And retrieval, finding that file and bringing it back when we need it.
But sometimes those files get lost, right? Or corrupted. We forget, we misremember things.
True. Memories aren't perfect recordings. Our emotions, attention, even how we encoded the memory can all affect things.
It's more like we're reconstructing memories each time, not just hitting play.
Right, and different types of memories are stored in different places. The hippocampus is key for new memories, the cerebellum for those procedural memories, like riding a bike.
So even if one part of the brain is damaged, other memories might be okay.
Exactly. The brain's amazingly adaptable. We have short-term memory for holding information briefly, like a phone number.
And long-term memory for, well, the long haul.
Right. And within long-term memory, there's explicit memory, conscious recall of facts and events, and implicit memory, which influences us without us realizing it.
So explicit is like remembering an event. Implicit is more like knowing how to ride a bike without thinking about it.
Exactly. Our memories are super complex and fascinating, and there's still so much we don't understand.
So how does all this connect to thinking and intelligence? Are they all related?
Oh, totally intertwined. Thinking is basically how we process information, problem solve, make decisions, use language. All of that depends on learning and memory.
It makes you realize how connected everything is in the brain. We wouldn't be able to think critically without those memories.
Exactly. And intelligence, well, that's a whole debate in itself. There's no one definition everyone agrees on.
Yeah, I get that. We often think of IQ, but is that really the whole story?
Definitely not. IQ tests measure certain abilities, but they don't capture all of human intelligence. Now we recognize it's more complex. There's emotional intelligence, practical intelligence, creative intelligence.
So it's more than just book smarts.
Right. It's about understanding emotions, solving real-world problems, coming up with new ideas.
And this is all influenced by nature and nurture, right? Genes and environment.
Both. Someone might be naturally good at math, but if they don't have good education or chances to learn, that potential might not be fully realized.
Right, it's not predetermined. It can be shaped throughout life. And that makes me think about learning disabilities, like dyslexia, dysgraphia.
Right, those affect reading, writing, and math. It's important to understand that they're not a sign of low intelligence. It just means the brain processes information differently.
And with the right support, people can still thrive.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about motivation. What drives us to act, to pursue goals, fulfill needs, seek pleasure, avoid pain?
We can all relate to that. I mean, we're always motivated by something. Success, connection, even just basic survival.
Right. And there are different types of motivation. Intrinsic, driven by internal satisfaction, like when you get lost in a hobby.
Oh, I love that feeling.
Right. And then there's extrinsic motivation, driven by external rewards or pressure, like working for a promotion or studying for a good grade.
True. Sometimes it's the carrot, sometimes it's the stick.
Exactly. But those external rewards can actually mess with intrinsic motivation, the overjustification effect.
So if you're constantly rewarded for something you already love doing, it starts to feel less enjoyable.
Exactly. It becomes more like work.
That makes sense. Now, we can't talk about motivation without emotions, right?
They go hand in hand. Emotions are complex experiences that shape our perceptions, thoughts, and actions. They can be tough to understand, though.
It's like they're the spice of life. They make things interesting, but too much can be overwhelming.
That's a great way to put it. And there are different theories about how emotions even arise. The James Lange theory says we feel afraid because our heart's racing, not the other way around.
Interesting. But isn't there another theory that says it all happens at the same time?
Yeah, the Cannon-Bard theory. Physiological arousal and the feeling of fear simultaneous. And then there's Dr. Singer's two-factor theory. It adds a cognitive piece. We interpret our arousal based on the situation.
So a racing heart could be fear in a dark alley, but excitement before a performance.
Exactly. Our thoughts and interpretations matter. And don't forget culture. Some cultures are more expressive, others more reserved.
So how we show and experience emotions isn't just biological, it's also influenced by our culture.
Which brings us to personality, what makes us unique. Those patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, how do they develop?
I find that so fascinating. How personality influences our interactions, our choices, our well-being. It's like our signature style.
I like that. There are different theories about it, of course. Freud focused on unconscious drives in childhood.
So those early years really do leave a mark, even if we're not aware of it.
That's the idea. Then there are trait theories, like the Big Five. It categorizes personality into 5 traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
It's like a spectrum for each trait, and we fall somewhere along it.
Exactly. And those traits stay fairly consistent over time. It's a combo of genes and environment again.
Nature and nurture. So let's switch gears to social psychology. How are we influenced by others and the social context?
Social psychology. It's all about those social influences, whether we realize it or not.
I mean, we're social creatures by nature, right?
Okay.
So it makes sense that it would affect us.
Totally. We live in groups, interact constantly, and that shapes us. One big concept here is the fundamental attribution error.
Okay, that sounds interesting. What's that?
It's that tendency to blame internal factors, like someone's personality, for their behavior, and overlooking the situation.
So we're quick to judge without considering the context.
Right. And we tend to do the opposite for ourselves. Blaming the situation, not our own personality. It's actor-observer bias.
It's easier on the ego that way, right?
Probably. And think about social norms and roles, how our behavior changes in different settings.
Oh, for sure. Like at a fancy dinner versus hanging out with friends. We act totally different.
Like we're following a social script. Remember the Stanford prison experiment?
Oh yeah, the one where regular students became like brutal guards just because of the roles they were assigned. That's scary.
It's a controversial study, though, with ethical issues, but it raised big questions about social roles and power.
Yeah, those are things to think about for sure. So social psychology is a big field, right?
Huge. Conformity, obedience, groupthink, persuasion, prejudice, love, relationships. It covers so much.
Wow, basically all of our social lives. So let's shift to a more specific area. What about industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psychology?
IO psychology. It's all about the workplace, using psychology to improve things for both employees and organizations.
So psychology meets business.
Exactly. It's about creating a win-win.
I like that. So what do they focus on?
Well, things like job satisfaction, how to make work more fulfilling and motivating.
Happy employees are productive employees, right?
Actually, there's also work-life balance, leadership, organizational culture, workplace design, even the impact of technology on the workplace.
So they're looking at the whole picture.
Right. And they're involved in hiring, too, developing tests and interviews to find the best candidates.
So matching people with the right jobs.
Exactly. They also work on training programs.
It's like they're optimizing the human side of work.
And with remote work and all these new trends, IO psychology is even more important.
It's a constantly evolving field.
It is. Now let's touch on something we all experience, but that can really impact us. Stress.
Stress, yeah. That feeling of being overwhelmed. What's going on in our bodies when we're stressed?
Well, Hanselé, a big name in stress research, developed the general adaptation syndrome. It describes the body's response.
Okay, the general adaptation syndrome.
Right. It starts with alarm, that fight or flight response.
Our heart races, we tense up.
Exactly. Then comes resistance, where we're trying to adapt and cope.
So we're trying to function, but under pressure.
But if it goes on too long, we hit exhaustion, our resources are depleted,
Like we've run out of gas.
and that chronic stress can lead to serious health problems.
Heart disease, high blood pressure, even faster aging.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And don't forget the mental health impact. Anxiety, depression, burnout, PTSD.
So stress affects both the body and mind.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's crucial to find healthy ways to cope.
Exercise, mindfulness, talking to a therapist.
Those are all great. And having good social support, friends, family, that makes a huge difference.
It's like having a safety net.
Exactly. Speaking of well-being, what about happiness? We all want it, but what is it really?
The million-dollar question. It can be so hard to grasp.
Well, it's often seen as a state of mind, being able to experience pleasure, but also using your skills and talents to enrich your life and the lives of others.
So it's deeper than just feeling good in the moment. It's about purpose, too.
Right. Research suggests that strong relationships, meaningful work, physical health, and gratitude all contribute to happiness.
It's like a mix of internal and external factors.
Exactly. And we're not stuck at one level of happiness forever. There's the idea of a happiness set point, our baseline level. But we can actually shift that set point.
Wait, really? We can become happier overall.
There's evidence for it. And that's where positive psychology comes in. It focuses on the stuff that makes us thrive. Positive emotions, optimism, resilience.
Positive psychology. I like that. Sounds much more hopeful than focusing on what's wrong.
Exactly. It's about finding those things that make us come alive, that give us purpose and joy.
So we've covered stress, health, and happiness. Now let's talk about the more challenging aspects of mental health. Psychological disorders.
It's a tough topic, but important. These are patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that cause significant distress or impair functioning.
It's not just feeling down sometimes, it's when it starts affecting your daily life.
Yeah.
And the DSM-5 helps classify all these different disorders, right?
Right. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's a guide for professionals to diagnose and treat different conditions.
So anxiety disorders, those are pretty common, right?
Super common. It's like your alarm system's always on, even when there's no real danger.
So those feelings of worry and fear become really intense and overwhelming.
Exactly, like with phobias, where there's an irrational fear of something specific. Spiders, heights, you name it.
And social anxiety, too, that fear of being judged.
Right, even simple things, like ordering food, can be terrifying for someone with social anxiety.
And what about panic attacks? What are those like?
Sudden, intense fear. Racing heart, sweating, shortness of breath. It can feel like you're dying.
That sounds terrifying.
And there's generalized anxiety disorder, constant worry about everything, even small things.
Like you're always on edge?
Exactly, and often these anxiety disorders go hand in hand with other conditions, like depression.
It's like a domino effect.
Now, there are also trauma and stressor-related disorders. These develop after experiencing something really traumatic.
Like war veterans with PTSD.
That's one example, but it's not just combat. Car accidents, natural disasters, assault, any deeply disturbing event can lead to these disorders.
So PTSD, what are the symptoms?
Things like flashbacks,
Yeah.
nightmares, avoiding reminders of the trauma, feeling numb, being on high alert all the time.
Like the trauma keeps coming back even if it's over.
Right, and it can have a huge impact on your life. Then there are mood disorders, all about disturbances in mood and emotions.
Like depression, right?
Yes, major depressive disorder. It's more than just sadness. It's a persistent low mood, loss of interest, changes in sleep and appetite, fatigue, feeling worthless.
It's really debilitating. And it's important to remember, it's treatable.
Absolutely. And then there's bipolar disorder, which involves shifts between mania and depression.
Mania, that's the high energy, elevated mood state, right?
Exactly. It can involve euphoria, racing thoughts, even risky behavior. And then it swings to depression, those lows.
It's like a roller coaster.
Now, schizophrenia is a more severe disorder.
People often misunderstand it. It's not about having multiple personalities.
All right, that's a common misconception. Schizophrenia involves a break from reality. Hallucinations, delusions.
Hallucinations are like seeing things that aren't there.
Right, and delusions are false beliefs, like thinking you're being followed or have superpowers.
That sounds really scary.
It can be. There are also negative symptoms like flat affect, a lack of emotion, and avolition, a lack of motivation.
So it's not just about having these strange experiences, it's also about missing those normal emotional and behavioral responses.
And then you have dissociative disorders, disruptions in consciousness, memory, identity, often linked to trauma.
Like dissociative amnesia, where people block out parts of their memory.
Exactly. There's also dissociative fugue, suddenly traveling and forgetting who you are, and dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder.
That one's really controversial.
It is. These disorders can be complex to treat.
Now, we've covered a lot of disorders here. What about personality disorders?
These are patterns of inflexible and maladaptive traits. They cause real problems in relationships and life.
So it's more than just being a little different. It actually affects your ability to function.
Right. Borderline personality disorder is one example.
Intense relationships, fear of abandonment, impulsive behavior.
Exactly. And then antisocial personality disorder, a disregard for others, maybe even criminal behavior.
So like a lack of empathy.
It's often linked to conduct disorder in childhood, which involves aggression and rule breaking.
These are tough disorders to treat, I imagine.
They can be because those patterns are so deeply ingrained, but therapy can help. Speaking of treatment, the history of mental health care has been a long journey.
I can imagine. How did people used to treat mental illness?
It's a dark history. People were often locked away in asylums, treated inhumanely. Thankfully, things have improved.
Dorothea Dix, she was a big advocate for reform.
A true pioneer. Conditions slowly got better and treatment approaches became more humane. And then there was deinstitutionalization.
Moving people out of institutions and into community settings.
Exactly. It aimed to integrate people back into society, but there were challenges. Many lacked support, ended up homeless.
It's a reminder that even good intentions can have unintended consequences.
And today, mental health care is offered in a variety of settings. We have a much more nuanced understanding of mental health now, and there are a lot more treatment options available. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've covered a ton of ground already, from the history of psychology to learning and memory, even touching on those psychological disorders and how treatments evolved.
It's been quite the journey.
Yeah.
But there's still more to explore, right?
Absolutely. This time, we're going to zoom in on something truly fascinating: how our senses and perceptions work together.
It really is amazing how our senses are constantly bombarding us with information. But our brains somehow take it all in and create this seamless experience of the world.
Like a symphony of sensory input. Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, textures, all woven together.
Okay, so let's start with vision, probably our most dominant sense. How does it actually work?
Well, it all starts with light. Light enters the eye, passes through the cornea, the pupil, the lens, and lands on the retina at the back of the eye.
That's where those photoreceptor cells, rods and cones, come in, right?
Exactly. Rods help us see in dim light, while cones are for color and sharp details.
It's like having two sets of eyes, one for day and one for night.
And then those signals travel from the retina through the optic nerve to the brain, where the real magic happens.
So the brain is where we actually see the world, not just our eyes.
Right, and it's not just passively processing information. The brain fills in gaps, corrects distortions, even predicts what we'll see next based on what we've experienced before.
It's like our brains are always one step ahead, making sense of things before we even fully register them.
And that brings us to depth perception, our ability to see in 3 dimensions. That's how we judge distances, navigate the world.
Without it, we'd be bumping into everything.
Right.
So how does our brain create that 3D view?
It uses a combination of cues. Binocular cues require both eyes, like retinal disparity, the slight difference in what each eye sees. The brain uses that to calculate depth.
Makes sense. And then there are those monocular cues, right? The ones we can perceive with just one eye.
Exactly, like linear perspective, those parallel lines that seem to converge in the distance.
Oh, like railroad tracks.
Yep. And relative size. Objects look smaller as they get farther away. And interposition, when closer objects block those farther away.
So our brains are constantly putting these cues together to create a 3D world from a 2D image on our retinas.
It's pretty amazing. And speaking of amazing, how about color perception?
The world would be so boring without color.
I agree. And it's thanks to those cones in our retinas. They're sensitive to different wavelengths of light, which we perceive as different colors.
And there are different theories about how it all works, right?
Yeah, there's the trichromatic theory, which says we have 3 types of cones, each tuned to red, green, or blue light. But then there's the opponent process theory, which suggests it's more about opposing pairs of colors. Red versus green, blue versus yellow, black versus white.
So when one color in a pair is activated, the other is suppressed.
Exactly. And that helps explain those after images we see. Like when you stare at a bright light, then look away and still see a faint image.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that. And it's interesting how our perception of color can change, depending on the lighting, the surrounding colors, even our mood.
Totally. Our brains are always adjusting and recalibrating. It's not as straightforward as it seems. Now, how about hearing? Another essential sense for communication and connecting with the world.
I know sound waves travel through the air and into our ears, but then what? How do we actually hear those sounds?
Well, those sound waves make the eardrum vibrate, which then sets off a chain reaction. It vibrates those tiny bones in the middle ear.
The malleus, incocus, and stapes. I always think of a mini orchestra in there.
Haha, I love that. And that smallest bone, the stapes, pushes against the oval window, which leads to the cochlea. That's that spiral-shaped structure in the inner ear.
Cochlea, right. And it's filled with fluid.
Yep. So those vibrations travel through the fluid and stimulate hair cells on the basilar membrane. Those are the sensory receptors for hearing.
Ah, so that's how the mechanical vibrations get converted into neural signals.
Exactly. And those signals travel through the auditory nerve to the brain where they're processed as sound.
And the brain does even more amazing stuff with those signals, right? We can locate sounds, tell the difference between pitches and tones, and understand speech.
Yep. Our brains are amazing processors. And don't forget, expectations, past experiences, and emotions can all affect what we hear.
Oh, totally. Music is a great example. Certain songs can bring back vivid memories or evoke strong feelings.
Absolutely. So we've covered vision and hearing, our two most prominent senses, but we can't forget about the others, like touch.
Touch is so important. We feel textures, temperatures, pain. It's both protective and pleasurable.
Exactly. And it all starts with sensory receptors in the skin. They respond to different types of stimuli, pressure, vibration, heat, cold, pain.
So different receptors for different sensations.
Right. And those signals travel to the brain, where they create our sense of touch. But it's not just about physical sensation, it's tied to our emotions and social connections, too.
The feeling of a hug or holding someone's hand, it's so powerful.
Touch is a powerful form of communication. Now, what about taste?
Taste. Another one of those senses we often take for granted. But without it, food would be so boring.
Definitely. We experience taste thanks to those tiny taste buds on our tongues. They contain receptor cells that respond to different chemical compounds in food.
So those receptors tell us if something's sweet, sour, salty, bitter, or umami.
You got it. And umami is often described as that savory, meaty taste.
I can totally taste that in some foods,
Mm.
like mushrooms. And it's fascinating how our genetics, culture, and experiences can affect what we like and dislike.
Totally. Our taste preferences evolve over time. And smells, too. They can trigger such strong memories.
I know. Certain smells can instantly transport me back to my childhood.
That's because those olfactory receptors in our noses send signals straight to the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain.
It's like a direct link to our emotions. So we've talked about the 5 basic senses, but aren't there others too?
Right. We have the vestibular sense for balance and spatial orientation.
Ah, so that's what helps us stay upright and not get dizzy.
Exactly. The vestibular system's in the inner ear. It has fluid-filled canals with hair cells similar to those in hearing. They detect movement and tell the brain about our body's position.
So if that system's off, we might feel disoriented or unsteady.
Exactly. And then there's proprioception, our sense of body position and movement.
It's what lets us touch our nose with our eyes closed or walk without thinking about each step.
Right. It relies on sensory receptors in our muscles and joints. They tell the brain about where our body parts are and how they're moving.
It's like an internal map of our bodies. It's incredible how much sensory information our brains are constantly juggling.
Absolutely. Our senses give us this incredibly rich tapestry of information, and our brains work hard to weave it all together, creating a meaningful picture of the world.
It's a complex dance between sensation and perception. Our brains are constantly constructing our reality based on what we sense.
And that interplay shapes everything. Our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors. It's what makes us human.
It's a reminder that reality isn't objective. It's subjective. It's shaped by our senses, our brains, our experiences.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into psychology, we encourage you to take a moment to appreciate your own senses. Really pay attention to what you're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and feeling.
It's easy to take it all for granted, but it's a truly remarkable process.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the human mind, and that it sparked your curiosity to learn even more.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey.